So I actually want to introduce Dave Innes to start things off, because Dave has got his show and tell project here, our precision feeder that we want to demonstrate to you. And Dave comes from Dennis Poppy and Simon Quigley's lab in Australia. He did his PhD there, and he's been here doing a postdoc since February of this year. And his research for his PhD was about, studying the regulation of feed intake in sheep, and was taking samples from the brain and doing gene expression of these brain tissues with RNA-seq. So he's totally an expert on that. And Boning is teaming up with him to do some RNA-seq. So if you guys want some assistance with that, he's got some R code that's really great for doing stuff. He's totally a computer whiz, electronics kind of tinkerer, I would say, to make this apparatus here, which you see has got like a Pringles thing in it. And there was a day when he came all excited to me. He's like, oh, I found this old printer laying out in the hallway and I got to scavenge some parts off it to make this thing. So this is part of what we want to demonstrate, is maybe give you guys a little bit of food to get you in the room here. But Dave, I'll turn it over to you to walk people through your.
So this is actually, well, it's a pretty high-tech precision feeder, and that's what we want to demonstrate. This is actually the future. So we're going to demonstrate that to you now. So we put out 3 tags. There's 3 people with a tag. Come on up, and we're going to see if it works. I'm not sure if everyone can see it on the camera, but I'm going to try and annotate it a little bit. It says, please approach me to the device. Okay, so it says, please, so all the instructions are up here, so you can't just stare at the please scan the RFID tag. So you'll have to hold it pretty close on that. Yeah, on there. Nice and close. A bit closer. There we go. All right, so it says accessing historical records. It's going to scan the body condition score. That's done. Reparameterizing the model, determining a diet for you, and then we've chosen a large dose.
I can lock that down.
And you eat salmon during rhythm.
My body condition score is low.
So yeah.
Do I have to eat all these at once? Share them and pass it around.
How many left in it?
There's a lot.
All right. Who's next?
There you go. Can I scan this?
Yeah. Hopefully. Okay, so this is a different group. It's going to do the same thing: access historical records, scan body condition score, reparameterize the model. And I think you'll only get 1 dose. That's it. If you want some later, you can come on up. All right, this is a different group again. What have we got? Accessing historical records, scanning body condition score. Whoa, extreme BCS detected. Denied. Missed out. But yeah, so that's our high-tech precision feeder, and I think they've had enough already, so they're going to get
Deeply offended.
But at the end, we'll,
I have to take them home now.
so yeah, that's like, I don't know, it's kind of just a demonstration of that stuff's all stuff we just bought on Amazon. And actually, they teach this in high school now to kids, like how to make little toys. That's a Raspberry Pi. Like that keyboard is actually a computer, and quite a powerful computer, believe it or not. So yeah, that's demonstration done. At the end, we'll put it back up. So if you want to play around with it.
Yeah, so that gives you a little feel for what we're actually going to be doing here today with the idea of precision feeding and what do we do about it. So let me share my screen. Oops. We already were sharing, eh? And
Minimize the, yeah, that's it.
so this is the title, that we put for the talk, but actually a couple of weeks ago, I met with Dave and I said, okay, we got to do a CNM seminar. And this was the title I had in mind, simulated consciousness design for controlling feeding equipment like this. And we said we should get a better title than that, something maybe more intriguing or something like that. And so I went away, and that weekend I was on the train going to see Gordie Johnson down in London. And I got thinking about stuff, and this book from 1968 came to my mind by Philip K. Dick. It says, "Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep?" It's the name of the book. It's the inspiration for the Blade Runner movies that you may have seen. And I got to thinking, yeah, they do. And, they do dream of electric sheep or electric cows. That's what we're going to talk about today. And so I sent the title to Dave. I said, "What do you think about this?" And he goes, "Yeah, it's suitably like vague and intriguing enough that maybe get people to come. It's our first live session for CNM seminars in a couple of weeks, in a couple of years." And then Dave was like, "Oh, I'm aware of some AI that's online that if you type in like a set of words or phrases, it'll draw a picture." So he typed in a seminar title into this one. It's online, Starry AI, and that's the picture that we got for it. And it's like, oh, that's pretty cool, And I even got to thinking, well, maybe the AI could just do our whole PowerPoint presentation for us, And that's not that far off, because in the latest Scientific American issue, there's an article in there about an AI that wrote a publishable paper about itself. So I look it up. It's under peer review right now, but this AI is called GPT-3. So that's the first author on the paper. It's available as a preprint here on this HAL open publishing site. And GPT-3 wrote a paper about itself. And so for the intro, the humans give it a prompt. And this is what they say: go ahead, write a 500-word introduction, use scientific references and stuff like that. So it wrote the introduction. And same with the materials and methods and results and discussion. There are some prompts that are given by the people. Here, write this paper. So I'm thinking, it's too bad Mike Steele has left already. This would be, I can totally see this happening, that you finished your experiment, you got all your results, and you just give them to the AI and say, "Here, do the stats, write the paper for me." The authors here of this article said it took about 2 hours for the AI to write the paper. They said they could probably do one a day kind of thing once they get this going. So yeah, you could totally beat Mike Steele with this. Maybe it's not really going to be the best at this stage, but I can see this coming in the future. About 5 months ago, we got another email from the administration saying, "Oh, look how great we are. Here's one of these university rankings that's happened." But this research.com ranking thing was done by an AI, machine learning system. And it doesn't just rank universities, it ranks scientists and then writes a biography. So the AI machine learning system writes biographies on people. So this is mine that got written up. Says that I work in such families of science as feces, phenols, dry matter, and urine. Yeah. And then my work on Latin square and abomasum frequently connected to yellow grease. It's like, okay, I guess that's how I'll be known in the future when the AI machines take over the world and write the histories based on the data that's around there. This is what I'm going to be known for. And it doesn't just stop there in AI writing about science. Maybe the AI will do science. So, the movie Arrival is based on a short story by this guy, Ted Chiang, who has written a few pieces of speculative fiction, I guess you call it, for Nature. And so this is a Nature short story that was in the year 2000. And it talks about humans becoming more advanced and hooking together with each other with like a Neuralink type of thing and hooking with AI machines. And they're so advanced, these metahumans, that their science that they do is incomprehensible to regular people. And so every so often they write like dumbed down literature reviews so that regular people can understand them. But the science they're doing is super complicated. And so just let a couple more people in. So there's I can get rid of that. Yeah.
John,
Hey.
are we allowed to ask questions as you go?
Yeah, I think so. Sure.
My brain already hurts.
Okay, well, just wait. But
Yeah, these metahumans are programming, or are these people that are behaving in the network?
They're behaving in a network, so it's a group of humans and AI machines together, that are all linked together, like through their brains kind of thing. So you've got, yeah, a lot of computing power and creativity and things like that all coming together. And so this is a quote out of the story, is one of the costs to regular humans was the realization you'll never do science again, like you won't make an original contribution. So that's in Nature magazine. So that's the introduction kind of AI, get you, get your brains hurting a little bit. And now let's talk about precision feeding a little bit more, and then we'll tie everything together.
I mean, precision feeding is a bit of a buzzword. So, and it's not a new term, but even at the conference in Kansas, like a lot of people at ADSA were talking about precision feeding, and this is the future. And it is really, it's all about delivering the right amount of feed at the right time for an animal. And so that can mean different things. So this is the 700 cow dairy in Australia, and I built this system for the farmer because everyone was pulling a cable that distributes the grain 6 times, but 6 times for every person was meant a different thing. So having a nutritionist balance a ration for the amount of grain was almost meaningless because they were all just getting a different amount of grain every day anyway. So that's like, for him, it's like, yeah, we're doing precision feeding. Step 1 is let's just try and feed the right amount of grain. But really, when we're talking about it, we're going from thinking about averages to individual animals. And currently, if we're formulating a ration, we really have this like model cow, and the model cow is based on the average production, but also like the nutritionist knows, okay, there's a few downfalls in this model. We might just bump up a few of these things we're trying to aim for. We really want our herd to be up here, but you still have one cow that represents all the cows at different stages of lactation, different milk yields, and they are all individuals. And we know that, like, some of them are just a little different. Some of them do strange things, some of them behave differently, and they also eat differently, and they have different requirements. But the variability between these animals is actually, I think it's an opportunity. And if we talk about this opportunity, we need to be able to measure the variability. So I think Lucas is online, and this is, if he jumps in, he can explain. I'm not sure how we see that. But this is his slide. This describes the Allura dairy system. And he's put this together just to describe. I really wanted to highlight to everyone the amount of data that we have there may not quite be appreciated. So I don't know if we see, I'm not sure if he's there.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
If you can...
Yeah, feel free to speak. So I was just going to ask you, like, could you quickly describe the main sources? Like, in the blue there is just a bunch of databases and computers. And there's a huge amount of data that, like, I think it's cool that you can sit at your computer and you can see all of that. So could you quickly just describe that so everyone's on the same page?
Yeah, sure. So this is just a high-level overview of all the data that we have at the Ontario Dairy Research Centre. So I kind of grouped them according to their area. So you have milking systems on the top right. We have 3 milking systems. So we have the robots, the tie stall, and rotary, and all of them, you have different data being collected. So you have feeding data from the robots that goes to a computer, a Windows computer. You see it at the top there. You have confirmation coming from body condition scores. You have milk yields and all associated data from the yields. And also attached to that robot, you have the herd navigator that collects other chemical components that can give information about health of the animal. That goes to another computer. Tie stall, same thing. We get milk yields, goes to another computer. Rotary, kind of the same idea. So they all come together. From those milk yields, we also collect weekly samples and monthly samples from the bulk tank. They all go to Lactanet or DFO. And then from there, we get all our information. So from the milk system, there really is a lot of information that we extract automatically. And all of this information from this various computers, they all come to a centralized server here at the farm. In the same way, we have sensors that are on the animals. So that's on your top in purple there. So you have color from DLaval that measures activity, which is tied into all of these different milking systems to corroborate with the information that is put out from DLaval. Oh, that's great. Thanks. You also have heat time colors from all flats that get rumination and activity. So they go to other aspects, other computers. You have for the calves, you have Forster's technique colors that measure activities on the calves at the nursery. So all of this come together again to a centralized database here at the farm. For the feeding systems, we have attached to that Forster's technique the calf feeder, so we can get feeding from concentrate or milk replacer depending on the age of the calf. We also get half body weights from those animals too, and they all go to a cloud-based database, which then we pull from there to our servers here. If we move a little bit to the bottom, we have the Incintec bins where you can have feed offered and put the orts as well on the another database that's on site. And then from that database, we also pull. So we have feed intake for every visit of the animal. So from that feed, we also take dry matter intake, dry matters, and those dry matters, we send part of that for a feed composition analysis that we get from a third-party lab. So we get the weights too, so that can be used, all saved in our database. So for animals that are not on the Incintec bins, especially the animals on the tie stall and maternity, we have it's called a super data ranger cart that staff goes through the stalls, drop the feed, and then we can measure how much it was dropped for that animal. The following day, they come with a cart, shovel it back into another cart that weights, and then we get the orts. So we have the feed intake as well. We also have a ventilation system, so that ventilation tracks temperature, humidity. There's also wind speed that I didn't put on that. So that is across the barn, inside and outside of the barn. And I recently found out as well that we also have an actual weather station here in Elora out in the field. So we have official weather data that we are starting to capture to ourselves as well. And from that, we also have data that are associated with a particular research project. So for example, we have green feed machines. So John has one there, and Dr. Bays has another one as well. We also have behavior analysis that are measured, and those go to manual notes. Even though this research as researchers' data, we don't collect them on a routine basis ourselves at the farm, we are definitely open into helping researchers to get that into a database, ours or themselves. We are happy to help with that. And on top of that, we also have animal events that is just everything that happens to them at the farm. So registration, health, injuries, foot training, cooling decisions, reproduction. So all of that is captured here at the farm. So this is this is all I could map, but there's plenty more that doesn't fit on that that diagram. So it's pretty amazing the amount of technology here that we have at the dairy farm.
Yeah, thanks, Lucas. That's perfect. So that gives everyone a really good rundown of the amount of data that we need. But really, everything we're talking about today relies on having access to be able to collect numbers about the animals. So this is like Patty did this with her masters. She calculated any energy balance for every individual cow in an experiment. This is like a code that describes her model in Python that she wrote. I've just kind of squished it so it fits on a page. And it takes some inputs. And so like Lucas just explained, we need those different systems to be able to put together the information to run these models on every cow. So the Incintec feeders plus the dry matter. We have the walkover weigh, the test day milk analysis, and which is monthly or weekly. The milking parlor will collect milk yield. And then we also have the green feed, which isn't integrated in the system automatically, but it's all the data that we're using just in that model. So if we look at his slide again, that's actually only just a handful of the information that's available to us. So there's a huge opportunity there. The variability is often considered outliers, and it's interesting, like if we're doing experiments and we have treatment means, then we will group together a lot of these animals and compare treatment means. And if something doesn't quite fit in there, sometimes it's like, oh, maybe that's an outlier. It doesn't really fit. So we have to be really careful when we're just looking at one animal for like a week, a period of time. It may not be an outlier. I'm going to use the Incentech data as a bit of an example for that. There's a few steps involved. Like this is raw data that's collecting individual events where an animal goes up to a feed bin. And we have to collate the daily files, format it so the computer can understand it. And we'll pull out like a week-long period. That's kind of what we're interested in at the moment. If we can do something every week. We have to group the data by feed bin because every feed bin has a different amount of error and there might be a problem with the feed bin. And so when the data comes in, and it's kind of like a feeding event happens, and then slowly over the day, like the cows eat, and then the weight recordings for the start and end weights will decline. And that's how you should expect it to work. We can plot that same data with feed duration on the bottom and the amount of intake up the side. So then that's actually showing 4 hours. Obviously, some cow didn't eat for 4 hours. That's probably not right. But this is a code that I wrote to classify potential errors. And one of the big ones is these negative intakes. And anything below that line is a negative, which didn't happen. But it's probably because they couldn't get a good end weight when the cow was feeding, and then it just records a weight and it could be higher than the start weight. But if we look at the next row of data and the start weight's lower, we can trust that that's probably a better indication of the end weight. So we can then adjust it. So those pink dots are like rows where we can adjust it. There's some rows where we can't easily detect what's wrong. It's just like, okay, we need to remove that. But every time a cow visits, it's an event. And if she's mucking around with the feed bins and she's getting all these negative intakes, we don't really know what she ate if we remove that data. So that's actually 300,000 data points over 30 days. And we're replacing 20,000 manually. And that's what it will look like after we've tried to clean it up. So it's not perfect, but without using like statistics and regressions, we can kind of clean it up a fair bit. The last thing is to then group it by cow and clean it. And we can remove like around the 0, we can remove, but then we can look at flagging any outliers for a cow. We need to treat every cow differently as we've spoken about them. And that's the slope, like these are the lines of fitting just like the same data just for each individual cow. And we can see that most cows are eating around 150 grams per minute using the regression. But then we see that some cows still have a higher rate of intake than others. So if we look at just one of those cows, this is just her for 30 days, the feed duration. We can see it's a lot nicer data, but we have these red dots, which are outliers. If we pick one dot, that's 12.5 kilos in 36 minutes. That's not unreasonable to believe that a cow could do that. So we should look into that a little bit further. And we can see that that was the event on her timeline. If we plot the timeline of the feed intake data, there's a 12.5 kilos that occurred at about 10:50 a.m., which her last feed was at 10 p.m. the night before. And we can also see that she's only feeding from bin 12. So this means that she was probably in an experiment, and the experiment, for whatever reason, meant that she didn't eat for a period of time. So when she did get some feed, she really ate. And so that's not an outlier. That's a real event. If we were going to go back and pull that red dot down onto the line, we're really discounting how much she ate for that day. When we have such large numbers of rows of data, if we're just using thresholds, like that is a 7 standard deviations, like that will discount all these points. And actually each one of those points is a different day in a row, where she was obviously having this treatment. Every day should have one large meal. So they're all real points. This is typically what you would see from a cow who's feeding from multiple bins, just having little meals from all different bins across the course of the day. So as we're thinking about feeding into the future, there's different ways of thinking about it. And one terminology is to use humans in the loop of decision-making and on the loop and out of the loop. At the moment, really, we're in the loop. So we have cow-side sensing. That information, like once a month, maybe a nutritionist comes, you pull the data together, you might run a model, the human makes some decisions, you then optimize it and formulate that ration, and then humans are feeding out all of that feed every day. So once a month, like we kind of branch off and this occurs. We really want to move towards on the loop. And this is where the cow data is being collected automatically. It's being integrated in a model, and then it's optimizing and formulating a ration and then delivering that feed by itself. And the humans are able to intervene and we're able to supervise it. So we're not out of the loop altogether. We're kind of on the loop. But the key thing here is that this model is then weekly, it's collecting this data, it's reparameterizing itself, storing a copy of what it predicted was occurring, and then the cows will it can observe what happens, and then it can reparameterize in the next week. And so this is for every individual cow, not just a herd. And it's kind of storing information about every cow as it learns about what the cow's doing based on the predictions that it's making. The initial step is really to introduce dynamic parameterization to systems that we have. And one system I observed, I was in the Netherlands recently, a lot of barns have these concentrate feeders, some with like multiple augers that go in, a bit like robots in Canada. And they just say, okay, well, this much milk here, this many days of milk helps us decide how much grain or what grain they get. But really, we can introduce more interesting models to integrate with these systems as we move forward. But we're really moving towards farming a herd of virtual cows. And John Deere talks about it too, like with their farms, you're farming like your farm in a virtual farm. We're farming the virtual cows, storing information about all the cows. All right, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, good. Yeah, what was that game that was on Facebook for a while? Farm, I can't remember the name of it, where you would like have your virtual farm, like a game.
Or Heyday, one of the two.
Yeah, so there's a few of them probably. So that's our electric cows. So let's get into the androids dreaming part of the title. And to get there, I'm gonna, maybe tell you the long story. So maybe you'll prefer at the end. There's like, I wish it had been short, but it goes to COVID when it first happened. One of the things that really impressed me was how everybody kind of agreed to do all this stuff, to stay at home and wear masks and things like that. And I'm not talking about the mandates, although that's what this graph is related to, but it's just how much everybody was on board with this kind of stuff. And it's like, wow, normally in politics, everybody's scrapping. Of course, that's what we got to now on parts of it. But I was really impressed by that cooperation that was going on. And also one of the things that made it possible for us all to stay at home was the internet, and everybody's got Netflix now and Uber Eats and all that kind of stuff is happening. And it really fits with this whole internet of everything that people are talking about. Like everything is hooked together through the internet. And that reminded me of when I was on sabbatical, my first sabbatical in 2005 in La Paz, Mexico. And I was reading this book called The Evolution of Individuality by Leo Buss. And this book was about these major transitions in evolution that have happened on the planet Earth. And, primarily it was talking about the individuality of cells. So there were single-celled organisms at one time, and there were no multicellular ones. So all these individual cells are like thinking about themselves, right? They're just looking out for themselves in terms of food and predators and all that kind of stuff. But then multicellular life forms arose, which is the single cells all coming together and giving up on their selfish interests and instead working towards the group. So they're like cooperating. And that's one of the big things that has to happen in order for these major evolutionary transitions to have happened on the planet over the course of the 4 billion years. And so cooperation is one of the things that has to happen. Communication between the different individual constituents of whatever system it is. Like if you're talking the eukaryotic cell coming from prokaryotic cells being engulfed, like they've got to be able to communicate with each other. And so those are two of the things that I'm seeing in the pandemic. I mean, there's a bunch of other characteristics that have to happen, like conflict avoidance. Maybe we're not very good at that yet. But I'm all, well, what's next? Like there's got to be another transition that's going to happen eventually. I don't know when, but I was sort of imagining, well, humans and their AI machines. So kind of like that story and the question you asked, Christoph. And I was calling it a superorganism. So like when we would go to the pub or whatever, oh, what are you working on, John? Superorganisms. And I don't really like that word because you could use that word any stage along here. The multicellulars are superorganisms compared to the eukaryotic cells, that kind of thing. So it's like, well, it needs its own word. And so this is during the pandemic, we let our hair grow long and we're on Zoom meetings all the time. And I came across this book by a French guy. I read the English version of the French one, Symbiotic Man. And he came up with a word, symbiont. So it's like, okay, that's the word. That's what I'm looking for, a word to describe this sort of planet-sized macroorganism of a combination of biological entities, us, and synthetic ones, the AI machines, and all working together in synchrony as a big cybernetic system. So it's got homeostasis and that kind of stuff. So to think about it, like what this symbiont would be like, and would it be planet-sized? Like, does that make sense? I just looked at a few of the previous transitions that have happened. So in terms of, say, chemicals going to cells, I was like, well, let's take a cell, 12 micrometer diameter. I can figure out the volume of the cell, and I can figure how much space like water takes up. So I can calculate how many molecules of water would be in a single cell, if that's all the cell was made of. And it'd be 3 by 10 to the 13 molecules. And maybe that's not a great estimation, because what about, you know, a cell's not just water, it's like 75% water, 25% dry matter. So I said, okay, what if it's the dry matter is glucose? So like a metabolite size molecule, then we're 1 by 10 to the 13 molecules in a cell. But either way, you know, it's about a 13 orders of magnitude size increase happened when we went from chemicals to cells. And if you look at the number of cells in a human, so that jump is also about 10 to the 13 fold change. So I'm like, well, then that's probably the size change we could expect for the next superorganism that comes down the chain. So I'm like, how big would that be then? And so I'm like, okay, what if there are all these constituents of the cybiont are like the size of a human, like the volume of a human? So I have got 63 liters here. And I calculate that if that's a solid sphere all packed together, it's about the size of an asteroid. So 7 kilometers in radius. But it's like, that's not really what I'm imagining. I'm imagining the superorganism is on a planet, like the planet already exists. And so it's layered on top of a sphere. So I said, oh, okay, what if it's a meter thick over a sphere? How big is it? The surface area of that would be about the size of Mexico, or 2 Ontarios or something. And then I was like, well, you know, them all being packed together is not really the way I imagine it either. I imagine it like this, you know, the way we live, and people have parks and places to do recreation, and they live in their individual dwellings, whatever they are, whatever our housing is in the future. So these are some density values for various cities or countries like Singapore. So I took Singapore's density of how many people there are per square kilometer. And if I do the surface area of what that would be like layered over top of the planet, it's about the size of Uranus. So somewhere between Mexico and Uranus. And it's like, yeah, that's planet size to me. And if you think I'm like totally crazy, well, that's totally fine too. But this is a 2007 paper from an evolutionary biologist at Yale who wonders the same thing. You know, are we in the middle of a transition from individual to group? One of these, this is the phrase they use, major evolutionary transitions. So beyond that, I got thinking, would the cybiont be conscious? You know, and I know that we are, or I feel that I am, kind of thing. So would a cybiont be conscious? And there's a lot of literature on this kind of stuff, artificial consciousness and how to create it, and how to build robots with artificial consciousness. Like, there are a lot of papers out there, and people are working very actively in this area. It's a little fraught because you're probably familiar with this Google guy who was fired for thinking the AI was conscious or sentient. That just happened a few months ago. He doesn't have tenure like I do, so I'm allowed to think about this stuff. And so that, you know, to answer that question, would it be conscious, is to think, well, what is consciousness anyway? And so you can go down a real rabbit hole of philosophy. That's what this Starry AI took that prompt and made a picture for me. And I don't want to go down there, but just sort of the things you might think of consciousness. And the one I like is a mental state that you are aware of being in. So awareness of yourself is consciousness. In the artificial consciousness literature, they call it how it feels to process information. And I don't know that that just passes the buck. It doesn't really say anything. But a lot of people talk about consciousness as a 3D workspace, a place for you to do work in your imagination. And to me, an example I think of and notice all the time is if I'm trying to figure out the date of Sunday, let's say. I know today's the 29th, and so I kind of map out in my head, okay, I'll put the days down, and I'll put the numbers down, and it's like, okay, Sunday is the 2nd. That's how I figure out what the date is in a few days. And that's an example of the 3D workspace. Working memory is another word that people use to talk about consciousness. It's the same as working memory. And working memory is something, you know, you just hold it in your head for a few seconds. It's very transient like that. And they find that working memory is not exactly the same as consciousness because they do experiments where they can like subliminally put stuff into your memory without you being aware of it at the time. But then your consciousness can use it later. So the way they think of working memory now is they talk about it being like a cave wall. So you're in a dark cave and there's a wall there and you've got attention, which is a flashlight you can shine on the wall. So you can look at different parts of your working memory. And by shining the flashlight on these things, you make them available to all these other processes going on in the brain, like long-term memory and problem solving, for example. You know that you don't actually use your consciousness to solve problems. It's the other parts of your brain that solve problems. What you do with your consciousness is you arrange the problem, like on a bulletin board or something. You put up stuff and you arrange it, and then your brain solves it for you. Like you have your eureka moments, right? And that's, you can be just walking along or sitting on a train or whatever. And the idea pops, the answer to your problem pops into your head. And so your consciousness helps with the problem solving by arranging stuff. But your brain is the one that actually responds to that. So that's kind of how the 3D workspace works. And in 2017, there's a paper published, a mathematical model of embodied consciousness. And they have in there the 3D workspace. And the equations that they use for this projective geometry are the same ones that you would use to make a 3D movie from 2D images. So it's a projective geometry into a 3D space. And so they use the exact same mathematics for that in this consciousness model. And their picture here is blue person is the one whose consciousness we're talking about. The space here, they call the lived space, this 3D workspace, includes like your visual, what you see visually, but also the other senses, what they are providing to you. And you can see what's projected in front of you, or you can project what your sensory organs show you. You can also perceive projections of the room. Like I can imagine what this room looks like from different angles, or as I'm standing here, I can imagine what stuff looks like behind me. You know, like if this guy hears a noise, he can imagine something that's behind him. So your projections that you do within that space can be from your point of view and from other points of view. This is what the brain does. And by making the projection, you make stuff available for these other systems in the brain to work with, and without your awareness. So an additional feature, you've got this 3D workspace that you work in. To be aware of these mental states, there actually has to be another mental state that is aware of them. So there's sort of copies of things going on in here. And this picture out of another 2017 paper in Minds and Machines illustrates the concept. So R is a robot. It's a artificial intelligence that has memory. And it is perceiving the outside world through these monitors that it's watching here, M0, M1, M2, that are connected to a camera, you know, to get visual or auditory information. But the MO here is actually connected to a camera that's looking at itself. It's looking inside at the brain. And if it's just like this, the way it is, you know, R cannot move around. R can look at different monitors, but it can't like wave its arms and see itself on the screen and go, oh, that's me. But R can look at these different monitors, and if there's no time delay of anything, the only time R could see itself is if it was looking at MO, and then it just sees itself looking at MO. So maybe that's one thing, but these guys say if there is a time delay, then R can say be looking at M1, and then when it looks over at MO, because of the time delay, it sees itself or a past version of itself looking at M1. So the past version they call R prime. So R can see R prime looking at M1. And then of course, if it moves again and looks other places, or if more time goes by, it can see itself watching MO, remembering another version of itself watching M1. And so this stuff can go around and around and around, like second generation, third generation, fourth. And that's where the sense of self comes in. that you realize there's something that's always in the middle of this sensory perception. And it's like, oh, that's me. And so that's how consciousness figures out a self to pay attention to things. Okay, so where did consciousness come from? So one idea is sort of, you can think of it as like an evolution from a reflex. So a reflex is very quick, and as soon as you get like a sensory perception, the nerve signal doesn't have to go all the way into the brain and out to the muscle to get a reaction. It can just go to the spinal cord. So this is like a 10 millisecond kind of a thing, a reflex, from the time you're hit till the muscle moves. And maybe then for consciousness, it just got more sophisticated and went through a central, through the brain, the central processing of what the sensation was, figuring out what to do as a response to that, and organizing the motor sequencing pattern that needs to happen to make the muscle move. And so this is like a 500 millisecond time force for that. So consciousness is a lot slower than a reflex action, which is the reason, like if you're in sports or whatever, it's like, don't think about the move, just let the reflexes do it. It'll be much faster. But this guy, Cotterill, who I'm getting this stuff from, said, no, that's backwards thinking, and that's kind of, this thinking is kind of what they call the blank slate, that an infant is born with a blank slate brain. And as it gathers more and more sensory information from living in the world, it fills in the brain with all that kind of information. And Cotterill is like, no, it doesn't work like that. That's backwards. It's actually an inside out mechanism. So the original source of knowledge or whatever comes from inside the brain. And there's some internal drive, an action decision is made. And then the motor sequencing is done to cause the animal to move, to then change its environment. And then it gathers information by that. So it's a probe by movement kind of thing. And he used as an example, not with the central nervous system, but like a paramecium with a flagellum. And that it's just going to wave its flagellum around and move to other parts of its environment and sense, like, are the nutrients better over here or worse? And then it'll just keep moving and probe its environment and map it out and figure where it needs to go. And so that's the way Cotterill says, and many cognitive scientists say we should think about it. It comes internally, and it's gotten sophisticated in a central nervous system where you don't actually have to do the muscle movements. You can just pretend to do them and simulate the muscle movement. And so it's a probing by a simulated movement, and actually paying attention to something is the same as planning a muscle movement. And I don't know that you're aware of that because I wasn't. But if you look at this site from McGill University about the brain from top to bottom, it says the basic function of the brain is to produce behaviors which are first and foremost movements. So the brain is all about coordinating movements. And if you're like, Christoph, you're intently listening here, like if you're paying attention to what I'm saying, your brain is actually sending out motor commands to your mouth to get you to talk and say the kinds of things that you are paying attention to, except you just don't carry out the muscle movement. So the motor sequencing that normally would go to the muscle, a copy is made of it. An exact copy of that same signal is made and it's sent through the same system, but it doesn't get all the way to the muscle. And it might get, like say it's about moving your arm or something, just a sec, it might get, within the body to the nerve fibers that are in the muscle, but those nerve fibers will send information back to the sensory cortex instead of carrying out the movement. So it simulates and it uses the memory and the learning that the nerves have done in those tissues to simulate what would actually happen if you made that movement.
Are you saying, John, that the decision to make that movement has already been made at some level, and it's really suppressing the movement all the time? As opposed to activating the movement, it's
Right.
suppressing the movement, kind of like,
Well, in dreaming, that's what happens. So then there's active suppression of the movement while you're dreaming. So you're paralyzed. And one of the big neurotransmitters for that is glycine. So yeah, that does happen. Here, I think it's the way the hardware is set up of the nerve transmissions. It's actually sending a copy of the signal to a different sort of system. So it's not exactly the same system. It's a copy that's just to lead to the sensory apparatus. So it's a motor signal going to the sensory detection. Does that fit? It's like silent reading. There's another example. It's like when someone learns to read to themselves, they learn to read out loud first. And then you can say, I don't actually need to do the muscle movement. I can just keep it. But if you look at the brain's activity, it is sending out motor signals while you're silent reading. Or especially like if you come across a word that you're not familiar with and you got to sound it out, your brain will send out the muscle signals. You just don't do them. So it just sends them to the sensory cortex instead. So we're quite familiar with that sort of simulation. I think silent reading is like an interesting window into consciousness, like a direct window in. So then that's, you know, according to this 3D workspace, that stuff that you simulate what the sensory response would be if you had to actually carry out that movement. But here's your simulated one, and you combine it with all the other systems to help you make decisions like, should I jump off that cliff? You know, kind of stuff. And this is the apparatus then that gets used to do all your problem solving and all your thinking and understanding and attention and all that kind of stuff. But you experimentally arrange ideas as if they were positions and motions. And so if you think that's weird, I mean, that's how computing works, right? It's just where are the electrons in the silicon and germanium crystals kind of thing. The position, or quantum computing, is all about position and velocity of atomic nuclei. So those kind of position and motion can be used to do a lot of fancy calculations. And so I can layer on top of that or replace that stuff I just said with that model, with the projective geometry and access to the other systems. And that's what consciousness is doing. And Cotterill would say, this maybe goes to part of what you're asking, Christoph, that this whole having to hold things in your working memory for a short spell, so it gives you the sensation of a conscious experience. And things like you got to overlay the motor commands that you send out with sensory information that comes in, and they won't come in at the same time. So what your brain does is put them together. And we're all familiar with like deja vu or whatever they talk about. It's that 500 millisecond time delay that your brain is doing all the time, overlaying its motor commands with the sensory information. And so, yeah, when did you actually send out the command? Half a second before you're aware of the thought about it. So you can sneak stuff in there.
Is this Einstein's thought experiment? Simulated process?
I don't know. I'm not familiar with Einstein's one. But Schrodinger, so also around the same time, had the same kind of issue. He wrote a book called What is Life? And based on his quantum mechanics knowledge. Stuff. He was like, okay, how do you know what is a living thing? So this is that consciousness. That's basically what you're doing in a dream as well. All that stuff, simulating sensory perceptions, and you feel them, and you work them in with your other systems, like emotion. Problem solving is probably kind of a little bit off while you're sleeping, I find. So the solutions, maybe you got to wake up and modify them a little bit. But you're sending out motor sequencing and stuff. So they see it during rapid REM sleep, but the motor signals are going out, but those are actively being suppressed. So maybe it's a slightly different in that regard. The muscle, you're paralyzed, which is like you can't swallow, which is like why you drool on the pillow, or not you, why I drool on the pillow. Or you're not even supposed to really be drooling as well. So that's the dream. That's the dream part. It's like how to make the androids dream of the electric cows. And so I've tried to sort of show parallels between the consciousness and then what we have in mind or what we could have in mind to do for controlling our precision feeding equipment. And one of the things I want to point out is that in the brain, there's that 3D projection thing, which that is a copy of the real world. It's a mechanistic copy of the real world. So we also have at the heart of this a mechanistic copy of the cow. And this is something that we've been talking about, like how do you combine mechanistic models, like the 3D projection mechanistic, that's a real representation of the world. And so it's not going to have, like you are going to know about cliffs and what they do, things like that. But at the same time, all around it, this is all a neural network. And so it's a machine learning type of system. And so it uses the 3D projection, but it's also using machine learning at the same time. And I think maybe the 3D projection is what keeps everything real. It keeps it safe for the animal. You know, that they're not going to do things that are outside the bounds of what are possible for it to do. And so that's kind of the role of the mechanistic model in here, is to keep it real. And it's going to be about a cow. But the decisions that are being made are about the formulation of the ration. And just to come back to this original diagram that Dave showed about the humans being on the loop. So yeah, we imagine cow side sensing. And of course, you got to do all this data cleaning and processing and stuff first to see where you're at. And then you, we're calling it dynamically parameterize each of your cows that are in there. So instead of having like a single equation like NRC has for maintenance or something like that, to say it's like this proportion of body weight to the 0.75, instead of trying to parameterize an equation for all cows, you just parameterize those equations for each individual cow. So the structure is good of the mechanistic model, but you keep this virtual copy of the cow and optimize the ration and so on. Well, what does it teach us to think about dynamic parameterization, but using this simulated consciousness design? Remember that this came from this whole idea of probing by movement, where the original action decision comes internally. So like from our control system itself, this dream is part of our control system. And so you to probe by movement would now be called probe by ration formulation. Also, you change the ration and actually see what the cow does in response to that. And that gives you information that you pay attention to. And so my question is, instead of us trying to keep the ration balanced all the time, should we be challenging the cows? We can do our parameterization way faster. Instead of waiting for a cow to get to 100 days of milk to really have gathered enough information about her to be able to predict what she's going to do next, can we probe her earlier than that and get information right away to parameterize each of those individual cows? And so as nutritionists, how do we do that? What kind of probing should we do? Of course, we've got to keep it safe for the cow. We can't say, oh, let's fast the cows for a week and see how they respond and get information from that. So this is, to me, where the model needs to come in and say, oh, that can't be done. You know, just like a 3D projection consciousness would come to a similar kind of evaluation. It's like, no, I'm not going to do that. So that's a question that I want to pose to you guys. If you can't think of questions, you know, I'll put it back to you. And then here's the other one that's always a consideration, is like, what are the objectives of the optimization? So, you know, we just say, oh, maximize profit. That's not going to work. That's going to destroy your herd of cows. So what are your multiple objectives? How do you optimize a whole bunch of different things at once? And not that I'm expecting answers to either of these questions. I know they involve a lot of different options, but that's where I'm going to leave it off and open it up to questions.
Okay. So I guess this is a comment / question, and I'm not sure what category to put it into. Is the limitation the ability to sense the data you want, as opposed to the calculations to do it? And so back to this analogy you're trying to draw between
the system.
Can you put your microphone on?
Yeah, it's on.
Oh, it is on? Sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
Yeah,
No problem.
yeah, we're drawing this analogy to a conscious system.
Right, and I would argue, okay, and you would, I mean, anyone who knows me would say that I have my doubt about belief or about belief in data and so forth.
Right.
I just said to a bunch of people yesterday, this idiom people talk about, you can't manage what you can't measure. I have huge problems with that because I think the brain as a problem solving engine does those things, right? It solves problems we cannot measure. And so is the question that, to your example of the 100 days in milk, do we need to actually develop the systems that the human manager could have seen? They could have seen the cow losing weight. They could have seen she doesn't look right.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Are we lacking the sensing ability to give you the data you need to solve this problem?
Likely, yeah. So likely as you get further into this, you'll get to things like, I wish I could do that. And to me, the dry matter intake is a perfect example of like, I wish I knew what the dry matter intakes of these cows were. You know, and how do you do it? And right now it's very expensive to do that. So there are going to be things that you have to work around because you can't really measure them. Yeah. But hopefully with doing this, you can identify which ones you really need to know well. So maybe there are ones that you think you need to know this, and it's like, actually you don't. And that comes up in modeling lots of times. Or what you sort of intuitively think you need, the model will tell you, no, you don't, you need something else. And so what kinds of challenges do you think you would need to, or you could do with cows? Like one thing that I would say is you don't want to do it too early in their lactation while they're like, since, you know, they're transitioning into lactation, and they really need to get on their feet first. So it's like, well, you'd lay off any kind of challenge in the first few weeks, like let's say a month or something like that.
But shouldn't we just throw out like, this is the transition of traditional thinking. Shouldn't we throw out all the traditional event dates? 305, 100,
Right.
40,
Oh, yeah,
60.
totally.
Like,
Yeah.
those have to all go in order to make your virtual.
Right. So that, I don't think, you know, that's like a bias, right? And so if the consciousness system is learning on its own, it's not gonna accumulate that bias. It's not gonna know anything about 305 days, unless it turns out that is the optimum way. They have AIs now that do video games, like race car video games, and they beat all humans now. And so I think it's Microsoft or somebody has that AI, and they're like, we gotta dumb it down to put it in the game, because otherwise it's just gonna beat everybody. Because after a few laps, it figures out the optimum way to go. And it's like, oh, here's the circle, and it just does that circuit. Well, I mean, it's gotta overtake other cars and stuff like that. But yeah, it can figure out what the better optimum is than human maybe to figure out.
Which stage in the cow's life do you think we should start gathering information?
Oh, that's another, yeah, really good question, because you could start gathering information as they're growing, right? There could be information in the growth phase of the heifer that would be useful. And I know we kind of trying to look at stuff like that now, right? But yeah, maybe that's the kind of thing that if you input it into a machine learning system, it will notice the important features that have relevance to, you know, when they're in lactation or something. So actually, I don't know. Actually, most of this stuff I don't know the answers to. It's just to see what ideas people have.
So for your mechanistic model, how do you figure out which parts of the model to test and at which time? Because at the end of the day, you're going to have essentially one equation. You can change a bunch of different things and you still get the same result.
Right. So you'd have to do like a sensitivity analysis. So that'd be something that we're familiar with. Like which parameters, when you change them, have a big effect on the predicted outputs. And so, yeah, you want to identify those, like which sort of predictions do you really want to know well, which comes to your optimization strategy. So I know those predictions, like if it's milk yield, body weight change, and greenhouse gas production, let's say, or things you really need to know well for your optimization, then it's like, okay, find which parameters in the model really affect that and then change those. And so I did before a model with Purina and we would do that kind of thing. So when you take the model to a new farm and they've got whatever fat and protein percent, that might be different than what your model has. You know, NRC assumes like 4% fat or 3% protein or something. But, you know, you on different farms, you have different percentages. So we would just, I have 5 parameters that I would change. Make the fat and protein percent and milk yields match up with the intake of the ration. So those 5 parameters then would adjust, and now the model works for that farm. Now you can do the simulations of what happens if I change the diet.
Like what I imagine is, you could structure, instead of feeding the same ration, you could have it set up to make small incremental changes. So it's kind of doing a grid search across different formulation possibilities.
Right.
And then maybe it could converge somewhere that you wouldn't even expect.
Yeah, so that's an interesting idea of like setting your protein and your energy or, you know, something like that, a grid of things. And you don't just have like the protein amount, but the protein quality or source or something. Same with the energy and stuff. So you could have pre-planned grid. Set a grid maybe for the cow. It's like, okay, let's take them through this in a 1 month period. Get all the information you need. But you got to be within sort of a safety range. And so I could even imagine like, well, now they do things with oscillating protein in the diets, right? Where they go up for a couple days, down for a couple days, or once a week they feed them like very low protein diet or something.
Yeah, there's some companies that could try that out.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on, of like not just feeding a balanced diet the whole time. In that case, it's letting the animal deal with it. And it also brings to mind, what does a normal animal do in terms of challenging itself? If this is a consciousness-based design, then, you know, an animal with a consciousness, what does it do to investigate its pasture or something like that? You know, Dave comes from, there's a lot of pasture research going on. And cows don't just go in and eat everything that's in the pasture. First, they will eat good stuff, and then the next layer, how that.
So we should throw the TMR out and go back to cafeteria stuff.
Yeah, I don't know that actually really works in cows. So some species it works better than others, and cows probably, because of the time delay of their digestion, probably doesn't work. But yeah, something where it's a controlled cafeteria style, like today is lots of fish, and tomorrow is like steak and lobster, whatever. So you've got different meals being prepared for the cow, and watching what she responds.
Since no one else is asking
Yeah.
questions. Okay, so the thing, based on the write-up, I actually went and read the Coles notes of the original book you're talking about, okay? And so the thing that's been hurting my head since yesterday has been, does the cow know she's a cow, and does the computer know it's a computer, okay? And no, really, so this becomes the next question. So when you were talking about the, you know, the planet level web, could you actually use this thinking to convince, and then the thing I'm struggling with is whether or not desire and motivation are the distinguishing features, right? Can we use this to motivate the cow? Like, can we implant her with a chip like the Borg and have her do the behaviors we wish her to do? Can we train her? No, seriously, can we, like, back to these idioms of 305 and, you know, all these sort of things, or if that's, you know, these biases, could we use some kind of system to help motivate her to make the choices to be as efficient as she could be, or optimize, whatever you want to call it, right?
Kind of related to that, I think I saw something that there's this farm in Russia that different has VR headsets. And they produce more because they think they're on a pasture.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of.
I think I kind of like the cat training collar or the dog training collar, right? So it does bark, you zap it, right? That thing. But something far more friendly and far more deeply embedded, right?
Something they don't notice.
Yeah.
These virtual fencing's a thing, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm thinking something beyond that, like something that,
Like an implant.
that operates at the motivation level, like that today, her job is to do this thing, to seek out what, I don't even know what to suggest as an idea, right? That she knows something is going wrong in her system, so she seeks out behaviors, say, to reduce methane. She seeks out behaviors to improve milk composition, right?
Yeah, so, yeah, I don't, so now your program, like your computer program here is relaying information directly into the cow's brain.
Yes.
To do it. So instead of manipulating a feeding system,
Yes.
you just manipulate the cow. Yeah, I can see that. Well, but then you probably won't need cows. The food will be made in a different way. But, and also the interesting thing about that is they do already have their motivations. And so that whole idea of the pro-life movement is that the motivation comes internally. It's pre-programmed. And it is quite amazing how much, I think that's the differentiating characteristic of a living thing is its motivation or tenacity to do something. And where does it get that from? That's like a vitality principle or something like that 200 years ago. But you know, that there's that living motivation to do things. And I ran across papers where they use xenophus oocytes, so frog oocytes. And you can put them together and they have the instructions to make cilia. They can make cilia. So they make what they call xenobots, like these little robots made of cells taken out of a multicellular animal, and they will combine together in a clump, and they'll move around a petri dish and stuff to find food. Like these cells taken out of the frog. That's crazy. So there's this tenacity of living things that we just need to do this. So I think the natural motivation of a cow is something that we need to know more of. And yeah, then you could manipulate it. But maybe with like bells and whistles. Scientific motivation instead of a neural implant. Who knows?
Is it a coincidence that the AI that wrote a paper about itself published it on something called HAL, which is the name of the robot from 2001: Space Odyssey that tried to kill everyone?
I was gonna put a picture of that in there, but I thought, oh, that's too much science fiction. But yeah,
It's a dystopia.
yeah. And Arthur C. Clarke also has in a book that I read recently, it's in the future, so it's in the year 2130. And it talks about how they find this relic in space. And it looks like maybe these aliens or whatever did agriculture. And he just makes a comment, always surprised they do agriculture at all. Why would an advanced society do agriculture? It would just be for like exotic food or something. Just like, I totally think that's what's gonna happen here.
Wasn't that kind of the premise of Childhood's End?
Childhood's End, it has a superorganism that's, instead of being put together by Neuralink or whatever, it's put together by ESP. So, yeah, certain people are good at ESP.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask my question, but I'm gonna say it out loud, and I'm not sure how sensible it will come out.
Is your microphone on?
Yeah, that one's on that.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
So obviously, like this, it sounds a lot like what we're talking about is like introducing like reinforcement learning techniques, right? So we have like our under, machine learning, we have like our supervised learning, which is most of what we do in most of our modeling, and reinforcement learning is really like make a change, see what happens, like learn by mistakes and stuff.
Yeah.
And obviously, like I've thought about this, like this loop a little bit too, and like how I've been thinking about it, like within mechanistic models is, when we parameterize or like learn how that individual animal responds to a given intervention, like we might have that biological structure built into our mechanistic models, but we know that like around those parameters that there's uncertainty, right? And so how I've been thinking about it is, yeah, like can we set those kind of what is a typical parameter around a bunch of different parameters and then let it vary within those bounds to fit it to an individual animal. But then I was wondering, like obviously our mechanistic models are also a simplification of reality. And so if we learn that the animal responds differently than what's in that bounds, does that give us information to go like a level deeper in our mechanistic models to explain that variation, or do you build that knowledge in via like the machine learning side of it? Does that make any sense?
Yeah,
Like,
so
where does that learning go? Does it
Right.
come back to the mechanistic model in terms of like our core understanding of how
I think,
biology works?
I think
or-
that's what the memory is. So, you know, that kind of stuff would happen in. Yeah. Like, and so there's a couple points based on what you said. One of them is that people say, one of the guys who talks about this coming from the internal side, and it's an inside out mechanism, says that, the neurons, what, in a brain that's like not empty, but a brain that hasn't learned stuff yet, its neurons are still firing. And when when the brain learns more stuff, there's not increased neuronal firing. What it's doing is matching up the observations or the sensory data with these firing and making a pattern, making a connection. And so now it's like, okay, now I'm going to use that neuron firing pattern to represent this phenomenon or sensory experience or something like that. So it's always sort of, it's, I guess we talked about this, it's sort of like having equations that don't just, you haven't identified what Y and X are yet, but you just, here you go, here's an equation, use it. And it's like, when the system experiences something that matches that pattern, it's like, okay, I'll use that equation. You know, so there's that kind of stuff in the machine learning part of things that you can just attach behaviors or whatever to a certain equation. Yeah, I'm not sure whether you'd consider that machine learning or mechanistic modeling, like they do blend together.
Ray brought a mechanistic model.
Yeah,
That it's,
so I think, no, you know, like the 3D, if you think of the 3D workspace, it's not rewriting it. It's just how it's what representations are in there. And those have come from the memory, you know, from the past learning. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly how it would translate. I would think you just change your parameters to be outside the bounds of what you originally thought. You know, this has to be plus or minus 10 or something. It's like, oh, now I realize it's got to be different than that. But yeah, I think still we have to, as people, do the evolution of the model. You know, so in real life, the brain would have evolved to be successful. For us to make this successful, we have to do the evolution part ourselves, get the model able to handle all these circumstances.
How do I turn this thing on? So it's supposed to flash.
It's supposed to be green, yeah.
Burn, you broke it.
Give it a shake.
Okay. So my next question is,
This has nothing to do with the question you've asked of us, okay? In your reading and your time thinking about thinking, okay? Where did you land and where do thinkers land on instinct? Like, one of the things that still blows me away is that you can take a chicken, 21 days of incubation in a machine, so there's no way this chicken taught her chick anything, right? And that thing comes out ready to seek feed, seek water, right?
Yeah, totally. And like squirrels dig holes in the ground, bury stuff in it, like all these instinctual behaviors.
Yes.
Yeah, that was on actually someone's behavior qualifying exam, and that was my question. That's exactly what I wanted to know. Like, how does this stuff, and I didn't get an answer. Like, how does this stuff get hardwired in there? So when you're born or whatever, you've got these instincts to do. And so I think it is part of that whole neuron firing pattern type of stuff. It's probably certain types of neuron firing patterns that have been genetically encoded. So that particular pattern is under, you know, nucleic acid control. Yeah, where in the brain that would be, how that would be, yeah. I don't know.
And I guess I asked that question like back to your analogy between organic learning and machine learning, right? Like in the movie I, Robot, they get into this whole concept that, you know, robots would develop behavior patterns that we didn't program, right? And so is there any evidence in machine learning of instincts they develop?
I know, yeah. I don't know. Honestly.
No, we still don't know about the chicken either, so.
But yeah, that'd be a really interesting.
I think that's the next seminar title. What came first, the chicken or the robot?
I'm gonna do now.
That's-
Not me.
Okay, so I'm sure we can keep going for a long time with this kind of stuff. But thanks, everyone. And yeah, I tried to put up some like provocative kind of sign posters. They kept coming down, so I even put some on for like an hour before the seminar and they were down. I know my mission, but I know who's doing that.
Diana.
Oh, you're right.
Are you there?
It's pointing.
Okay. Anybody need some M&Ms?
Yay.